Here we are. I don't have an exact, I wrote a bunch of stuff on the board, so there's a plan of some sort there, but I don't exactly know what's going to come out of my mouth. I'm hoping I get into the zone, so it just comes flowing out in a really interesting, nice way. Two things today. Part one is kind of finishing a partial discussion of suicide and its consequences, which is such an important theme, important area of study in our field. Whole courses should be given on the self-destructive impulse, things that motivate suicide, the circumstances in which it occurs, the aftermath, the consequences of it for the survivors who are left. I only touch it, but I touch it kind of systematically by a listing in today's class of what I think some of the reasons are that it is so darn destructive. And, in a big class like this, there are going to be some people here who have had a suicide occur in your immediate or remote family. It's just frequent, it happens, there it is. I do not want to say that anybody who has been close up to a suicide in his or her family is done for, so please don't hear it that way. There's nothing that can happen to us that we cannot recover from, is what I think, or at least find a way to integrate and make part of ourselves so that we're not destroyed by it. And even sometimes we can turn it to a direction that deepens our strength to face the things that life has to offer. On the other hand, there's scarcely anything I can come up with anyway that is at least potentially more destructive to family members than a suicide of one of the people that belongs to that same family system. And I said this last time, that when I make the list of the things that hurt children, that eventuate in lasting emotional disturbances that are held to get past later in life and so on, I can't come up with anything more powerful than a mother or a father's suicide. And then why should that be? A suicide is much harder to recover from or move on from than a death. Death itself can leave a child stuck with lasting grief, with the impossibility of completing a mourning process. I should know, since that's one of the great themes of my life history, dealing with the lasting grief over the loss of my mother when I was a boy. But I had it easy compared to a number of people I've known whose beloved mothers or fathers have elected to die. It's a whole different question. When you lose someone you love because something happens to them, an illness, an accident, or some creep does something to them, they haven't participated, they haven't elected to die, and that it changes everything. Suicide is a volitional act. It's kind of weird to talk about that. What does it mean to say that suicide is a volitional act? It's like a decision made by someone to end his or her life. But the phenomenology of suicide, it isn't really exactly correct to say it's volitional, or certainly to say it's a free decision, because, as I was telling you guys last time, it occurs in a context of overpowering despair where there's no way out. It's the antithesis of freedom. On the other hand, it is kind of the last gasp of freedom in a world where all freedom has been taken away. It's the doorway out. I have a little subsection in the chapter on suicide in Abyss of Madness that has a title, if I can remember it right, Seizing Power in the Cavern of Despair. That's my little unpoetic, poetic title for that section. The idea being that when all options have run out, you're in an unbearable and a completely, infinitely unacceptable situation, whatever the details are. There's no doorway you can find to go through to help you out of this. There is actually always just one. And it's the one with S on it, or D on it, for suicide or death. Okay? So, in a sense, it's the decision, the choice that is always left when all other choices are gone. So it's both true that it's a decision, a choice, a kind of strangely free act, but its context is the loss of all freedom. Otherwise, it's part of its phenomenology. I feel like our field needs to understand that more deeply. We need to study that. We need to study the circumstances that produce such despair. what are the lives like that are being lived of the guys that are climbing up in the Golden Gate, and maybe have traveled from Europe even to jump off the Golden Gate, or from wherever they come from. What is that despair state? We need to investigate it, describe it, explore it, know it. A lot of times a person in a suicidal crisis, if you look at their lives, or I do, we see great hope for them. We say, well, it's just that your girlfriend left you, you know, and okay, you invested everything that you have and everything that you are in her, but why do you have to die? There's more fish in the sea. There's a whole bunch of fish out there waiting in the sea for the fishing line to be set out there. But the person who's going to choose to die doesn't see that and can't see that. We can see it. And we act on the basis of that. If I see a person getting ready to commit suicide and I see a life in which I feel there can be hope, even that person can't see it, I will tackle them before they climb up on the bridge. And I've had to do that. I've never tackled anyone climbing up on the bridge, but I have tackled people as they try to climb out a high window in my own psychotherapy office and try to kill themselves, because that's also happened. You might find that amazing or think that wouldn't be true. Work in this field long enough, you'll have somebody trying to climb out that window. And in that moment, that's all they can think of doing. I'm going to tell you a case of a multiple personality. I'll touch it if I have time today a little bit. We're going to spend about 3 or 4 class periods on it, actually. And it was a woman who repeatedly tried to go out the window in my office, and I had to tackle and hold her back and restrain her as well from all kinds of terrible self-injuring behavior, trying to poke out her own eyes, slash herself up with broken glass and razor blades, and all kind of things like that. So there it is, the phenomenology of despair, a huge important area. Psychology hardly studies it at all. Why? Because psychology is full of baloney. When I take over, there will be whole courses on the phenomenology of despair and the acts associated with it, including suicide. Anyway, why is it so destructive? Well, what I've written on the board is, under Aftermath of Suicide, is a series of 6 or 7 items that come to me. Where do I get these? They're kind of common sense. You could almost figure out what they would be without having had that much experience, but they emerge for me from all the people I have known who have been around suicides, who have had to struggle and suffer with the feelings you have after they occur. I am one of those people, since I lost 2 of my closest friends, 2 of my closest teachers, and 2 of my patients that I've barely gotten started with, okay? And I hope never to have another one occur. I have 2 or 3 people I see now that I'm real worried they're suicide risks, and I just don't almost know what to do sometimes with what might happen. But anyway, that's what working in this field is like. It really is. It's not just sitting down having a pleasant conversation that either helps or doesn't help. Sometimes it's a matter of life and death, and you have to take it very, very seriously. That case I told you last time of the woman who got better, but it was a prelude to her suicide attempt, was a good, quick shock treatment for George Atwood to suddenly take his career very seriously and realize that the clinical work is often a matter of life and death. And it doesn't always show itself that way, but it might just turn out to be that. Anyway, what happens to someone in a family in which a family member commits suicide? A parent, a child, a sibling, an uncle or an aunt maybe. Someone to whom one has been very, very close. The first thing I wrote on the board up there is shock. This is phenomenology now. I'm talking about the experience of the survivor who finds out that there's been a death. But it's not just any old death, it's a suicide. As I'm talking about this, I'm finding myself getting upset. And the reason is I'm real aware of what it is. Long story short is a neighbor of mine, not that long ago, lost a 21-year-old son to what looks like a suicide. And I went to the memorial service, and I was close at hand. And this is a young man whom I have known since he was 4 years old. He was like part of the baseball league that my son shared with, and we got to know the families and the picnics and the parents and the families and all the happiness and the home runs and the strikeouts and all this kind of stuff. Heroin. Overdose, lethal overdose of heroin. It's a little ambiguous whether it's just an accident Because heroin, if you just take the stuff is a little purer than you thought it was, you inject it in your veins, and you just die. Or did the kid just give it up? And this is a very fine way to end your life. Whatever it was, I went to the memorial service, and it was, you know, it was a deal where they had the body of the poor boy looking totally normally. Wake up, kid, you're not dead. Just lying there, open coffin. And it had happened maybe 2 weeks before, 1 week, maybe only a week before. It can't have been very long, but before the memorial service, because they can't have his body just lying around even after being embalmed. But there he was, looking normal as anything. There the parents were. And I could tell they were still in a complete and total shock state. And you know how when you go to a memorial service, you shake hands with all the people, and you know it's like the end of a wedding or something. Except it's so sad because it's a suicide. I'm real upset now because I'm thinking about what this is and how badly it upset me. This young man died. I have these pictures of playing with him as a little boy with baseballs and so on like that. It's just heartbreaking as anything. But it looks like a suicide. So anyway, I could see that the parents were both in a complete and total state of shock. You know what told me that? They were smiling and laughing as they greeted all the different people. They hadn't even really taken in the thing had happened. It had been a week, but suicide is a tough one to swallow, that it even happened. You can't really do it. You go into the state of shock, and then your mind starts playing games with you. And often, a person whose spouse or parent or sibling or best close friend or lover has done this, often what happens is your mind just refuses to accept that it's taken place and blots out that it has occurred. There's a story of this in Nehemiah, Foundations of Psychopathology. You guys have to read that for the final. You better hurry up, not wait to the last minute, people. You bad people. Just like George Atwood waits to the last minute. I'm kidding about that. But it's a good study of depression and grief. And the story goes something like this. A woman comes home, or she goes out to the barn, or goes into a room that there's something there that she does not want to see, I'll tell you. And it's her husband hanging from his neck, dead as a doornail. She finds him, he's croaked, he's out. So she leaves the room, or the little office off from the side of the house, and goes back to the main house. This is a 40-year-old woman whose husband has just hanged himself, and calls up her husband's office and wonders and wants to know when he's going to be coming home. How could it be that you walk in and see him hanging there, and then you walk back to your regular phone and go in there and call your husband, "Hey Dave, is Dave there? Well, do you know where he is? I'd like to know when he's coming home tonight. Dinner's all ready, and it's served at 5. As if it hasn't even happened. So her mind has refused to take it in, that it's occurred. It's hard to believe, but it's true. People, and maybe you could understand it, because it's just like it's like, what? This can't be. This just cannot be. Sometimes what happens in reaction to the shock of such an event is that it's not obliterated completely, like with an amnesia, that you even know it. You don't even know it anymore. That's one possibility. That's the most extreme. But it's kind of like the emotional tragedy of the whole thing is just blocked out. So you know the fact of the death has occurred, but you don't connect to the horror, to the pain, to the depth of the tragedy. And that's what it was like when I visited the family. When the young man, I'll call him Chris. His name was not Chris. That's my son's name. Thank God this hasn't happened to my son. Oh my God. The rest of your life is just trashed by something like this. What the mother said to me in the receiving line, as she smiled, and I said, I'll call her Jane. I'll say, "Jane, I'm so sorry for your loss. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I knew Chris, your son, as you know, for years upon years upon years. It's just like inconceivable how this could happen." She said, "Don't feel bad, George. We are very, very happy." I said, "Well, Jane, why are you happy?" I didn't say it like that, like, "Why are you happy?" I wasn't like that. I knew she was in the state. She said, "It's the most wonderful thing. Little Chris actually succeeded in the career that he was building as a musician. He was a trumpet player, and he had succeeded in playing a piece on the trumpet that he had wanted to play for a long time. I don't know what the piece was or whatever it was, but it was a complicated piece of classical music or something. And he had managed to play that and had succeeded, and he'd always dreamed of playing this particular piece. And he did it. And isn't that just wonderful, George? Isn't that just wonderful? Big smile on her face. Oh my God. It was devastating to me. Much better if she would have been sobbing and weeping and crying and raging and pissed off and shouting at God or something like that. But no, it was like that. So I think your mind is doing something with it, with the situation, with the tragedy. And the shock of it is kind of pushed away. And then you focus on something else, and you can kind of be in this state of gratitude. I'm getting real upset because now I'm flashing on another suicide of a young boy I knew also quite well. I'm going to depress you guys today with these horrible stories. Are you ready? Fasten your seatbelts. Take your Xanax before I start to go too far, or your antidepressants. Maybe you got any Prozac? A little Zoloft. Bring me some, would you? Some of you probably do. Everybody in America's taking that stuff except for me now. Anyway, a 13-year-old decided to hang himself and did so. Details don't matter. The horrific family situation, a divorce, anger, fury, parents at war with each other. The boy just says, "That's it, I've had enough," hangs himself. And I talked to the mother right after, and she said she was very, very happy. And I said, "Why are you happy?" It's the same kind of thing. She says, "Because I know little Johnny is right where he belongs, on the lap of the Lord. God has called him back to himself, and it's the most wonderful thing. Don't you agree, George?" Oh, man. So her mind is playing games with it, too. It's so terrible, you can't take it in. The shock overrides a person's capacity even to register fully with emotions. Maybe even the sheer factual of the whole thing. So that's one thing right there. Death itself is a shock that is hard to register and can be denied in all of this. And another example comes to mind from the personality class that I teach. In my first book that I wrote with Robert Stollerow, The Faces in the Cloud, there's a chapter on the great psychoanalytic theorist Wilhelm Reich. And when he was 13, his mother killed herself, and it was his own fault. He turned her in for committing adultery, and so it was a whole nightmare where his responsibility was even part of it. But he tells the story in some private journals that were published long after his death that I got hold of what it felt like to find his mother dead. And he said it was a kind of biological marvel. He had never seen a dead person before, and he looked at her unbreathing body and thought how curious, and got real scientifically interested and just thought that's really cool. And it might have even shaped his eventual decision to get an MD in medicine. Study further this strange machine that can be alive and then it can be dead. So it's like the horror of the tragedy is blocked out. The sheer factual biology of the situation, passing from life to death, is registered, but the emotions are gone. Okay, and then Reich's life. If you're in my personality class, you know this. If you weren't, you should read about him sometime, or get my book and read that chapter. His life is a kind of slow disintegration from the effect of this suicide that follows him, and finally drove him completely out of his mind. He ended his life in a state of a profound paranoid psychosis and delusional world system, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, shock, and then your mind can't stand it, so it pushes it away, but it's there. And it's one of the things that will then eat at you. When you're given something in your life that you can't handle, your mind doesn't handle it. It protects itself, and you can go on for a period. But on the other hand, the thing is still there, only unconsciously. The feelings are still there, even if they're unconscious. And they will eat at you. I have secondly loss and sorrow. A suicide is a death. So a loved one, it breaks your heart. You will not see this person anymore. So all the feelings, all the sadness that belong to such an eventuality are going to be there too. But one can't just be in that sorrow because of the accompanying, complicating reactions that are also inevitably present. So let me talk about what the rest of those are, what a lot of those are. Rage. I don't know if it's inevitable and universal that the survivors of a suicide eventually reach a rage state toward the dead person. But pretty much everyone I've ever known who's dealt with these feelings does get there. And why? Because A suicide is a deliberate act. And how could you, the question is, how could you have done this to yourself? How could you have done this to us? I flashed for a moment on the story of a young man I know who tried to kill himself when he was like 21 or something. And he woke up from his critical condition hospital. This is not one of my patients, but somebody else I know, somebody else's patient that I heard this whole story from. And his family surrounded him on the not on the deathbed. It was a life bed because he was alive. But their first reaction was to attack him. How could you have done this to us? When he tried to kill himself. If the suicide is successful, that is still there, if even not more strongly. Okay, it's kind of heartbreaking to react to somebody who's tried to die by attacking them. Why did you do this to us? What's wrong with these families that they would do a thing like that? I hope I would not do such a thing if either of my children would ever reach such a point. And life can sometimes drive a person to a point like this, even if you raise them as good as you can and love the heck out of them. Life might just do something. Life is like that, isn't it? It's ugly. Life is horrible. Growing up is really rough. Wouldn't you agree? People say, no, it's not. Yes, it is. It's hard to just grow up, even if you have all the good things that can happen to you. It's still hard. Anyway, I'm not going to attack my children if they get there. I'm going to say, sweetheart, what in the world happened? On the other hand, I might not be able to help myself and be in a fury over the whole thing, too. You just don't know how you're going to react. So there's that. So there's rage. Rage against the loved one because of the act having been deliberate. My patient Grace, who is written up in the first chapter of Abyss of Madness, the one that is called Psychotherapy as a Human Science, the long case study of the so-called paranoid schizophrenic young woman who thought she was in the Trinity, it all traced back to her father's suicide. A giant part of her therapy, I only briefly mention it in the case study that's written there, after she finally got squared away and was not climbing up into heaven all the time and was getting more reasonable, and I had found a way to use the bond that we had built together, she and I, to support her recovery. A giant part of that eventual work was my listening to her, and her family listening to her too, about how pissed off she was at her father. She was then 30 years old. He had killed himself when she was 10. And she had buried all her feelings, and they had transmuted into all kind of strange relationships with Jesus Christ and God the Father, and she got off and running into a very strange sort of realm of mental life. But it all came together. And once it did, there were years of furious anger and cursing and shouting at her father for having done this. It's normal in this situation. What's not so good is when that's just buried and you can't even touch it at all, which is what it had been for her. There was only just the image of Jesus Christ, okay? So rage is another part of it. It complicates it. It makes it hard to just grieve. Like when I lost my mother as a boy, my grief was terrible. It was just awful what happened. But I was not plagued with rage at her. So sometimes though, when people just die, you get rage anyway. How could you die? How could you let yourself die? It's not normal to a degree, so it's going to always be there maybe to some extent. I don't remember that ever being part of my grief. I was looking around for somebody to blame, but I couldn't find anybody. Brain tumor killed her. Brain tumor was terrible. Doctors couldn't save her, they tried. Do I find out who the doctors were and go and shoot them? I wondered about that as a child. But they weren't the really guilty parties, so you just don't go anywhere with that. But that won't stop you a lot of times from still going into a deep rage reaction, like a part of us that doesn't really register the rationality of the situation and just knows someone was there that was beloved, and suddenly they're gone. You want to strike out. That might be there. Freud thought that's an inevitable part of loss, rage against the lost one. And the depression comes when we turn that rage back against ourselves. I was telling you guys about that last time. I don't think that's a good universal formula for depression, but there's something to it. There's always something to Freud. Guilt. Guilt, guilt, guilt. I've told you about my best friend Larry Schechter, who killed himself in 1972 or 3 in Missouri while I was out here. I knew he had a gun. I did not let myself think he was going to use that gun against himself. But looking back on it, I should have seen that. It was obvious. There's only one reason a really depressed person buys a gun. He's not going to shoot, he doesn't care about the robbers. He wants the robbers to come and kill him. He's going to use it on himself. It's obvious. I didn't let myself put two and two together. And I now have a scenario in my mind. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but I put it in the book when I wrote about this. It's in the chapter on suicide and abyss of madness. See, this is a depressing lecture, isn't it? I feel I should have put two and two together, recognized his impending suicide, jumped on a plane, told Rutgers to screw itself if it didn't like it, flown out to Kansas City, beaten his door down, taken the gun, thrown it away, got him down on the bed, banged his head against the wall, not killing him, because what good would that do? And say, I'm going to straighten you out no matter if it takes me years to do it. That's what I should have done. I feel guilty for not having done that. Every time you're around a suicide, you can't help it but look back on all you did and did not do. What did I do that contributed to this, that added to the depression, that led to this decision? What did I not do that might have saved the day? The agony of that self-doubt, that kind of that retrospective kind of wisdom of hindsight, second-guessing yourself, it's just, you can't get away from it. You just can't. You have to go through that process and go through that process. And it doesn't end because the death is final. So there's nothing you can do about it. So I have all of that. I've seen that again and again and again in people who were around suicides. That's what they maybe don't let themselves feel that for a long time, but then it starts to come to them. Tremendous feeling of responsibility and guilt. It doesn't matter that it's not perhaps realistic. It doesn't matter that maybe there was nothing you could do. How do you know there's nothing you could do? You always could have flown there, beaten the door down, and tied him up. Maybe fed him from a bottle or something like that to keep him alive. Put a nose tube in to keep him alive. You always could have done something. So one suffers with the knowledge there might have been something. See, I'm real upset now because each time I mention one of my stories, I'm taken back into the emotions of all that. It's okay though. Shock and then denial, loss and sorrow, rage, guilt. What was my next one? Shame. Watch out for shame. What's it like to be a child who had a parent who committed suicide? How does that child feel about others knowing that this happened in the family? What's it like for a parent whose child has committed suicide? What does that parent think the neighbors and friends are thinking about the death and about the family? Well, I'll tell you what you think. For example, I know that when my friends who lost their son to the heroin overdose, which may have been a suicide, they're covering it up that it was a suicide, saying it was an accident. But I think it was a suicide. But they're covering it up because if it becomes known that it was a suicide, they're going to be thinking, what do other people think of us then? What kind of parents are, and what kind of parents are we in the eyes of others? What kind of parents are we in our own eyes that we didn't stop our child? Or what did we do wrong for him and with him when he was a boy that he ended up with a heroin addiction? Heroin is dangerous stuff. Stay away from it. It doesn't matter what happened to you when you're a boy or a girl. It can eat your life right up, and I've seen it happen again and again. I have a friend who likes heroin and thinks you can just really take small amounts of it, and he invited me to come to New York for a heroin party. He said, George, why don't you come on in here? I've got some horse. I said, really? I said, really? He said, it's the coolest stuff in the world. It's illegal, so you got to be careful getting it and stuff like that, but we can snort it if you don't want to, or inject a little bit of it. I've been able to do it, and I'm able to just do it once a week or once a month, and free and clear. It frightened me so badly when he said that. I was tempted. I like to feel good. I like feeling good. I love drugs. Love them. But I know I'm a menace when I'm near a drug, and I'm so happy I was able to resist going in there for a little taste of horse. Hey, come on, come here. If I would do it, you know what would have happened to me? I would like it so much if I didn't overdose myself and die the first time. I would think after a month, I think I'll just try it again. Maybe it is okay. Then once a month I would do it, and then I might do it once every 2 weeks, and pretty soon you're off and running, and oh my God, your life is just shattered. That's the way that stuff works. And don't go there. When they call you, say, hey, come on in. Say, no. It's the best thing to do. But what are the neighbors going to think? You know, like you might say, about that you lost your son and you're worried about what the neighbors think? All you care about is your image, your public image? Like, what kind of assholes are you? That's stupid as a reaction, because we want to have a good public image. You're just human, and it feels bad to be disapproved of and criticized by others. And I remember when I was a lot younger, I had illusions that it would be possible to be liberated from all concern about how I looked to other people, what their opinions were of me, and that shame was somehow a weakness on my part if I was worried about how I looked. I tried to use Buddhism, I studied Tibetan Buddhism, and detachment, don't care what other people think. The details don't matter. This is not about suicide, but I did some things and got in some trouble that caused my public image to be blemished. Let's put it that way, okay? Doesn't matter what they are. Nothing fatal, nothing horrible. I was almost ready to shoot myself. I was so upset. Then I realized I can't help it. I'm very sensitive to the opinions other people have of me. And if they're really dark and negative and critical, I kind of die 1,000 deaths inside. But what I've had to contend with on that is small potatoes compared to what a parent whose boy has killed himself. Here's what they think. They think that the neighbors, which would include me, the problem is not what do the neighbors think, it's what they think the neighbors will think. They think, what kind of parents are we? What kind of crazy-ass family is this that a suicide could occur? They feel horrendously criticized and devalued and shamed. And the shame can be so intense it can be lethal itself. People kill themselves for the reason of being ashamed and not being able to escape the feelings of humiliation. Jane's mother, not Jane, Grace's mother, sometimes I call Grace Jane and whatever in my write-up on my cases. This is the woman whose father killed himself when she was 10 and turned into the Holy Trinity and all that. But her mother had to bury her husband in so-called unhallowed ground, because the Catholic Church does not think thinks a suicide is a mortal sin of some sort. You can't be buried, or you often cannot be buried without special dispensation in a Catholic cemetery. The shame that's involved in having to put your husband in unhallowed ground, all that, it just contributed to her mother collapsing for years after the whole thing. Shame is very important. I had a patient many years ago whose brother committed suicide, and one of the main themes we talked about, this young man, he was about maybe 25 or 6 years old. His brother had killed himself when he was 13, hanged himself for some reason, doesn't matter what it was. But the brother was so ashamed of the fact that he had had a brother, and he tried to hide the fact that his brother had ever lived from people. And then when they would find out, he would be afraid they would find out he died. Oh, you come from a family in which there was a suicide? It's a feeling like your family has this horrible blemish on it. And the blemish just rubs off on you too. It's not reasonable. It's not rational. Most people would be very sympathetic and compassionate about this, I think. That doesn't stop the person from feeling all this. And if something happened to my family, I'd be the same way. Shame is so important, how you feel in your public image. Can you ever hold your head up high again proudly, knowing something like this has happened in your family and that you didn't prevent it, and maybe even contributed to it in some way? If it's a child who commits suicide, something's gone wrong between the child and the parents, often at least, and so then they have to live with that. Okay? So you have that, shame. And then you have possibly the single most powerful destructive thing of all, and I have a complicated term I invented for this: retroactive invalidation of the relationship to the lost loved one. That's what it is. And what this means is that if one of the things about mourning, the mourning process, grieving, being able to come to terms with the loss of someone who's died in your life, is our ability to think back on the good times we had with that person, the fond memories, the lovely times that were shared and enjoyed together. And it helps you. You cry your eyes out when you think of these gorgeous times because the person has died, and but it helps you to have those good memories, and you kind of like symbolically return to the connection in the rehearsal of the memories, and then you cry and cry and cry, and it's all for the good. It's painful, but it's good. But if the person has committed suicide, it casts a doubt, it kind of casts a shadow over everything that you have believed in. Because this person I thought I shared a loving relationship with has decided to die. One of the things that means is that I have to face is that I was not worth living for. This is what a child has when a parent commits suicide. Grace had to realize when her father hanged himself that evidently she wasn't important enough to him to live for, because he chose to die. It's incontrovertible. There it is. Death was more important to him than a life that included her. How is she going to then be able to remember back the happy time she had with Daddy? And there had been lots of them. She couldn't think of them anymore. They seemed like lies. That's what it is. A kind of analogy to this. It's not the same thing exactly. Another friend of mine, not a kind of a remote friend, kind of / colleague. This is a story from 25 years ago too. Had a young wife that he was bananas in love with, and just to make a whole complicated story down to 3 sentences. She died from a brain aneurysm or something, just killed her, bang, like that. And she was only like 28 years old, and they had planned a family and all kind of things like that. So it was like a sudden, shocking ending to a beautiful romance that had culminated in a marriage and a plan for a shared family life together. He's a psychiatrist actually. Anyway, so he's in a shocked state, traumatized state, can barely stand to think about that it's happened. Heart is broken, crying all day long. But in a way, it's a normal grief with a shattering loss. In a way, nothing's really wrong with him. Human beings are somehow built to be able to handle loss. If it wasn't that way, half the world would be gone, because people have to face this. It's part of our lives. Loss occurs. We're finite. Death. Welcome to the world. So although he was tremendously upset and struggling with understanding it, full of sorrow, full of rage at God and all kind of things like that. How could this happen? Even though he was, like me, an atheist. But that doesn't stop you from raging at God at such moments. But maybe a month or 2 into the grief process, which was extended and deep and painful, but nothing was wrong. It's just what's what you have when you have such a tragedy. He's digging around in the closet at his own home, where she had been living with him, and he finds this box. What's this? He opens up, it's full of letters. Holy shit, what are these letters? They were love letters between her and a person she had been having an affair with. And they were X-rated. Okay, like your body, your luscious lips, you're this, you're that. Okay. What? You see what happened there? My colleague person had a complete nervous breakdown at that point, and was even transitory psychotic episode things, hallucinating and getting paranoid and delusional. And it not only did he have a shattering loss, he had a fresh shattering blow against his whole reality of everything he had believed in. In my book, I talked about epistemological trauma. That's what this was. A massive epistemological trauma, calling into question everything he had believed to be true. So that meant he couldn't just grieve and sorrow and cry about the beautiful picnic that he and his wife had had and the beautiful wedding ceremony. He's thinking about her with her luscious lips. You understand what I mean? With this guy taking advantage, ravishing her sexually, and that he hadn't known about it. It's analogous. This was not a case of suicide, but it's analogous to it in that it's a kind of factual thing that you confront that then casts doubt upon everything that you believed in up to that point. You just die 1,000 deaths. Your mind has betrayed you, and it made his recovery from her death so much longer, deeper, harder than it was. He did okay after 6 or 7 or 8 years. He got some very intensive therapy from a gifted person, not from me. He got support from me, but from a very gifted person. He was able to put himself back together again after a fashion. But it's as if he still has a wound, like a stab wound right in his heart that is still bleeding to some extent even now. Now we're 25 years down the road on that. But suicide is like that. Because you have a loss, but your ability to long for the person and love the person in retrospect is undercut by the fact that they've decided to die. So This really complicates the ability to just contend with the grief altogether. Now I don't want to make it all depressing and say that if you've been around a suicide in your family, you're done for. That's not right. Grace, in fact, even after all her adventures in psychosis land, made an essentially complete recovery and did fine for about 30 years, 25 years after that. But she did need to go through a process of grieving and mourning, and she did need enormous emotional support. I provided a part of that support. Her family gathered around her and were much better. In general, no matter how horrible the suicide circumstances and the impact, if there's really significant emotional support from other loved ones, you can get past this. But you do need them there to process it. But here's the last part of the consequences of suicide. What usually happens with a suicide in a family is that everybody's mind is so blown they can't help each other. Everyone retreats into their own private little cave. And so the desertion that is experienced in the first place by the self-inflicted death is followed by a whole series of mutual desertions by the family as people cave in on themselves and are not there. That was Grace's story in the Abyss of Madness first case study there. Her mother retreated to her bed and said, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, and was completely unreachable. Her brothers went into some other distant land of their own, and no one was there. Her priest wasn't able to understand her. Her teachers didn't understand her. She was all alone with an impossible dilemma. And so she solved it by turning to God and got herself in some real trouble then with her special relationship to Jesus and all that. Okay? So you have all this. So there's great hope for all. There's no trauma from which there cannot be some form of recovery or resurrection or integration that can be creative and healing. I'm a real believer. There's no such thing as a hopeless situation, except when you're dead. There's not too much hope for you then, unless you believe in everlasting life. And if you do, I would not take that from you or want to. I'm pretty skeptical that there's any such thing. I kind of belong to the Steve Jobs school of thought. Have you heard what Steve Jobs thinks of afterlife? It's the off switch. When you die, the off switch on your Apple iPhone just turns off. But then he pointed out there is no off switch on an Apple iPhone. It just automatically. He said he was afraid to put an off switch on it because it reminded him of death, which is the ultimate off switch. But he also mentioned, this is just boring, but Steve Jobs, his last interview, said that as he gets closer and closer to death, and he knew he was toast, he finds his mind opening up a little bit as to the possibility of an afterlife. That's generally what happens to us. As long as we feel safe and sound and are more or less the illusion we're going to live forever, you can afford to be an atheist and think you're going to, when you die, that's the end. But when you get closer to Mr. Death, Grim Reaper comes knocking, so I think maybe there's something to this afterworld after all. It's funny, isn't it? I find I'm not an exception to that. As I've gotten older, I'm getting more open-minded about it. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? It's funny, isn't it? But I think that I'm still predominantly a Steve Jobs off-switch man. You croak, that's it, the worms get you. The end. What am I teaching that for? I'm not teaching you that. I'm saying this, okay? So anyway, there need to be, I've just given you a kind of listing of items here, but there need to be profound phenomenological studies of suicide itself and all the ins and outs of the despair that produce it. There need to be profound phenomenological studies of the impact of suicide, its aftermath on the survivors. And then the understanding that is generated out of that should be useful in bringing people together in a healing way. One thing I know that can be tremendously healing for survivors of suicide is to join a group of others that this has happened to too. Because part of trauma as bad as this, it makes you feel isolated, like you're alone and the whole human world is in another zone and you're just all alone out there. And you need to be with people who also know what it's like, whose own sons and daughters have committed suicide maybe. And sometimes there can be then a wonderful joining together and a healing path can be found. It's no panacea, but it helps a lot. Okay? So, a lot of this is touched upon in the Abyss of Madness chapter on suicide. There's one important idea in that chapter I want to underline. I'm not going to give a lecture or case study or anything on it. Suicide as an affirmation of truth. In the section of the chapter called The Mothers of the Disappeared, I talked there about something I mentioned earlier in this class about how sometimes when people cut themselves compulsively, that can be about inflicting wounds in our flesh that have been denied. The emotional hurts that have happened to us have been denied and erased and obliterated, so we're driven to produce visible records of them on ourselves as a way of affirming the truth of what's happened to us. This is unconscious, but that's kind of the way it works a lot of times. Suicide itself can occur like that a person can decide to end his or her life as a statement of truth. If the events that have taken place are such as to make a person feel he or she has been or is being emotionally killed off, not physically, emotionally killed off, and then those events further are such as to erase that truth, that that's even occurred, sometimes a suicide will occur as a kind of affirmation. God damn it, you've killed me, so I'm going to kill myself, and my death will stand here as testimony to what you've done to me. A case that I'm convinced followed this pattern, I'll mention one case. It was actually the cousin of a woman whose therapy I supervised. So it's kind of complicated. I was the supervisory consultant in the therapy of a young woman, but her cousin killed herself. And the story was this. There had been a grandfather who was a massive sadistic sexual abuser, and he had had his way with this cousin since she was 4 years old up until when she was maybe 14 years old. And he had raped her in every conceivable way and tortured her and used instruments on her, and it was really a horrible case of sexual sadism mixed with pedophilia that he was doing, and he did it secretly. And he threatened to murder her and her family if she ever told, and so the wall of silence was absolute. But then, this woman, now in her mid-20s, she grew up, and the abuse stopped when she was 14, and she buried it out of her memory, didn't even remember it was there. It was a dissociation case. She and her cousin got together, and the cousin was the patient whose treatment I was supervising. She also was attacked by that same grandfather in the same way. Sadistically manipulated, tortured, made to suffer, made to be scared, almost drowned. Doesn't matter what the details are. They were so bad that it just blows your mind even to hear them, as how horrible it was. And they began to talk about their shared history of having been abused, and all the memories flooded back for both of them. It's really amazing. And so then the grandfather died, and he was a multimillionaire. And the whole family had been dependent on him and was really happy about the big fat inheritances that they were getting once he died. And they staged a massive celebration party with eulogies of the wonderful work he had done. And he was a kind of entrepreneur, and I forgot what his business was, but he'd made zillions of dollars with some invention or something like that, whatever it was. And meanwhile, he had been getting after these little children. But it was all hidden from the family, who were in a state of denial about the whole thing. And so what the cousin did, she decided the time had come to speak the damn truth about her history of sexual abuse at the hands of this iconic, beloved, revered, respected figure, the millionaire grandfather who had died of old age, basically, a cardiac infarction or something at age 78. So in the period of the memorial service where the eulogies were being given, a couple of them were given, what a fine gentleman, what a proud legacy he's left for us, and all this. She stands up and starts to talk about what he did to her sexually. Are you guys with me? You have to imagine a big room with like 80 people. All of a sudden, a young woman gets up and says, by the way, everybody, grandfather was not all he was cracked up to be. He also, and before she could even get one or two complete sentences out about the sexual attacks he had committed, 2 brothers and a couple of uncles came up and grabbed her and dragged her out of the meeting hall and went out to the front door and threw her bodily into the street and screamed at her she was crazy. What she was saying was unforgivable. She should shut up and go away. You got it so far? This was a family operating on the basis of embracing principles of denial about the ugly, horrible historical truths that had happened. What did this young woman do then? She killed herself. I can't remember if she overdosed or hanged herself or what, but she just decided, that's it, I'm going to end my life. And her thinking, according to her cousin who was in therapy with my colleague that I was helping, was something like this, that, okay, they bury the truth, well, I'm going to give them a truth they can't bury, I'm going to kill myself. And she fantasized that her death would then stand there as a kind of ineradicable testimony to the injury that she had suffered, and her cousin had suffered, the other patient, the patient that I was helping with. Did that suicide actually succeed in blowing that family open? No, it's really a sad story. You know what the family did with that? I found out what it was. They said, we knew she was crazy. The suicide becomes another symptom of the illness that they knew she had anyway. So they just used it as more